Thank you very much, Paul Rudensky, for inviting me to speak to your museum supporters and especially to the teachers in this teacher program, the educators program. I'm sorry we can't gather together in person. I was at the museum years ago presenting on the Goldfarb Diary to teachers. Maybe some of you were at that event and that we're kind of reuniting virtually today. My research has gone in a couple of different directions since then. That was I think over 10 years ago. And as Paul mentioned, it focuses on lesser known victims, again, back in Ukraine, but specifically on one photograph. And before I launch into my presentation, I just wanted to alert everyone in attendance that this is a very shocking photograph. It is an atrocity photograph. A very disturbing image from 1941. But it really is important to study these images and to study them in depth and to deal with them responsibly. And that is really one of the main arguments of my talk today, is not to conceal these images or to look away from them, but to, in a way, honor the victims by researching them and trying to identify everything that's going on in that image. So, as an educator, I can relate to your challenge, all of the teachers in the room, and also all of you who work in the museum world, which is also a world I like to occupy, given my history at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And going back to those early days in the public history realm, and also as a professor when I was at the University of Maryland system, in that system, I had often the experience of, in presentations, of seeing these kinds of atrocity images and seeing the ways that students and audiences responded to them. And this was before the internet really took off. So we could kind of handle them in the classroom with care and prepare our students and ask the right questions and so forth. But it's always a challenge to deal with these images. And yet they're so critical to the evidence of the Holocaust. And as we'll see today, often these images are all that we have of entire communities and families that were murdered, with seemingly with very little traces left behind, let alone family members. And the students would come up to me and say, Professor Lower, do we need to study these, or what do we do with these? Sometimes people just shut down when they look at them because they're so emotionally overwhelming, and that's not a place to educate from. So these are these challenges that I know that you are also experiencing. The image that we're going to look at today and the exercise we're going to go through in terms of what can be gleaned from an image, I hope will help you as educators talk with your students about the evidence that's there and the questions that can be posed to such images. Now, this is based on my new book, as Paul mentioned, which is coming out in February. And in the book itself, it's a series of images. We're going to focus on one today, but it comes from a series. And in the book, the entire series is published. We're not going to look at that today. And I just wanted to point out that in the book, there are images from the series that aren't as graphic. So if you wanted to tell the stories that you're going to learn today about this image as a teacher, you can still do that and not show the image. In fact, that we're going to look at today, you could show one of the images from this series. Okay. One of the challenges with these images is that when you talk to students, like in each semester, I always ask students at the beginning of class, when you hear the word Holocaust, what comes to mind? And people have these kind of visual recollections of what they've seen in textbooks or in museums. And they describe images of, say, the railways leading to Birkenau, or the boy from the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands up, liberation photos from the concentration camps, or maybe some stills from Triumph of the Will, some kind of Nazi imagery, Leni Riefenstahl's images of kind of goose-stepping Nazis and so forth. And if I press them to provide a caption or more information about those images, the students often just kind of shut down. They don't know the context, they kind of don't know the history, and in a way become accustomed to thinking that those recollections of images can kind of stand in for knowledge of the Holocaust. They kind of think that they know the Holocaust based on their own visual recollections and things they've seen on the internet. The photo documentation of the Holocaust, as you know, is really vast. And again, on the internet, the USHMM's photo archives has 120,000 digitized images in its collection. Yad Vashem has hundreds of full photo albums from perpetrators and victims. So these are forming our individual and collective memories and our sense of the knowledge of the Holocaust. But again, very little in-depth research on these photographs. They're often included as illustrations in a kind of, in books as supportive of a narrative, but not really the center of the narrative itself. Here is the image. Now I'm going to share my screen. If you could just bear with me, we can start the presentation. This is an image that came to my attention in August 2009. I was working at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Actually, I was working on a war crimes investigation of a perpetrator who was still alive in Germany, an SS man. So I wasn't there to do research on this per se. But at that moment, just coincidentally, two journalists had come into the museum from Prague, and they were kind of making their own, special visit to the museum and hand carried these images with them, and explained to my colleagues that they had found them in an archive in Prague, had not seen the light of day for decades, not since the late 50s. And they wanted to know more about this image. And my colleagues realized that this image, because it had a caption on it, had been taken in a town in Ukraine called Miropil, Ukraine. It's about 125 miles west of Kiev, east central Ukraine. I'm going to show you in a moment where that is on the map of Ukraine, so you can geographically orient yourself. But at this point in 2009, we knew it was taken in October 1941. We had a date on the actual photograph, October 13th, 1941, in Mariupol, Ukraine. And that's all we knew. We also knew, very significantly, the name of the photographer, because the image was in a file having to do with the photographer who was interrogated after the war because he was in possession of these incriminating photos. And my colleagues said, well, there happens to be a researcher here who works on Ukraine and maybe and works on that region, actually. So they brought it over to me. I was at the microfilm reading. I said, Wendy, take a look at this. And I was just absolutely astounded when I saw this, and for several reasons. First of all, I could immediately recognize that it's from the Holocaust. I could see the Nazi uniforms, the wartime era clothing of the European civilians, and the old rifles, and the boy with his family being shot by the Germans and local collaborators, which I thought was at the edge of a ravine. Now, I'd seen thousands of photographs and closely studied hundreds, but there are so few actually that show the killing in the act of killing. Most of the photographs of the Holocaust are all of the kind of surrounding events. A single photo like this was incontrovertible evidence, and it was quite literally a smoking gun. Now, this photograph, which shows this mass murder, not as heaps of corpses, but as victims being killed together, what I found striking was this family unit at the center. And the composition of this image is kind of in three parts. It's a stable image. It's not taken clandestinely. It's very vivid. Also, the fact that you have these militiamen, these are actually Ukrainians wearing red army coats, and they just have these armbands on, that they are shooting side by side in this kind of gang formation, shoulder to shoulder with these Germans. And in 2009, it was very unusual to find a photograph up close that actually showed a non-German, a collaborator, carrying out the actual shooting. These four men are clustered together in a loose formation, the Ukrainian in his heavy woolen red army coat, the German in a pressed jacket and jodhpurs have just pulled their triggers. The woman bending forward in her polka-dotted house dress with the dark stockings and leather Mary Jane shoes, holding the hand of that barefooted boy falling to his knees, dressed in that little tailored coat and pants. The victims are at the edge of a large pit. The woman seems to be dying from the bullet to the head, pulling the boy down with her into the grave. According to Nazi procedure, bullets were not to be wasted on the Jewish children. They suffocated in the blood and soil and the crushing weight of their own kin. In the foreground, you see in the photo a pair of men's leather booties positioned as if he had just taken them off, as if he had used the tip of the right shoe to pry off the heel of the left one. And next to the shoes, you see an empty coat lying on its side like the shell of a man's torso at rest. Empty bullet casings, the litter of mass murder, are scattered on the ground. I started to, as I analyzed the photo, I decided to look at it in pieces, like puzzle pieces. I looked at the shoes and I thought about the importance of shoes in memorial culture. We know about the shoes at the museum in Washington, D.C., for instance, behind glass, or at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. And so this was something that I found striking, these empty shoes, from a more kind of memorial symbolic theme. And here we can see it's broad daylight. And this is the Holocaust by bullets, as Father Desbois has termed it, wherein about half of the victims of the Holocaust were killed in these open air mass shootings and in ghetto liquidations that also were accompanied by these mass shootings. And it's not just that it's broad daylight in terms of investigating a crime and trying to figure out when it actually occurred, but the implications of that on the local community, that this is out in the open, and there are at this actual crime scene in these woods in this town in Ukraine, there are going to be witnesses, right? There are going to be peasants working the farms, working the fields, that are going to hear what's happening and see what's happening, and the sounds and the smell. And the fact that these landscapes are transformed themselves by these killing actions, which brought me into the realm of kind of forensic archaeology. So the book has a chapter on that change to the actual landscape in that community because of the mass murder that occurred there. The digging of the pit, which I thought was a ravine initially, and I later learned in my research that had been dug by Ukrainian girls and by the Jewish men who were then immediately murdered after digging the pit. The German killers, I could make out some faces of the Germans and study their uniforms and look at the cap and look at the emblems and the markings to try to figure out what unit was there, if I could drill down and try to figure out who the actual killers were. And here we see, again, this collaboration that's taking place here among the killers of the Ukrainian militia who are brought in for the task on that day. And these are Ukrainians who were from that town, who knew each other, obviously, the other Ukrainian militiamen, but also knew the victims. These were their Jewish neighbors. And here's an onlooker, a bystander, who's brought in to kind of do in the division of labor that the Germans introduced into this systematic mass murder, that everyone had a role to play, from the Ukrainian peasant girls who helped dig out this mass grave to these local helpers on the scene. I studied the smoke. I got in touch with ballistics experts. I wanted to try to figure out if anything could be, were there any clues in studying how the smoke appears here. And in fact, this is a kind of haloing effect, and it suggests rapid fire. This is a muzzle blast that is occurring simultaneously. And here the smoke is kind of, and you get a halo effect because of the way the blast punctures this smoke. And the ballistics experts told me that this indicates that you had, someone who, a group of victims had been at the pit prior to this group, that this is residual smoke from another group of victims that was brought to that site. Here is our photographer. This is really what was most surprising in the research on this one photograph, is that we have the name of the photographer. Again, very rare. Now, the Second World War era, actually coming into the 1920s and 1930s, the photography was basically coming into its own as a, not only as a profession, photojournalism, but as a hobby, because the first handheld portable pocket cameras were in mass circulation. Leica patented its camera, its portable pocket camera in 1925, and then it hit the market. The Zeiss Icon camera, which is the camera that was used to take this photograph, hit the market in 1933. By 1939, 10% of the German population owned a camera, and during the war, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, embedded about 15,000 photojournalists in all theaters of operation, and they produced 3.5 million images. So it's one of the most, not only do we have in the Second World War unprecedented numbers of war crimes, and the largest recorded genocide on record, but we also have the mass kind of proliferation of the handheld camera. So that many more images documenting those very crimes. Lubomir Skrovina, this is our photographer here on the left. And again, there is his camera. We'll get to that story because I eventually got to hold that camera in my hands, which was pretty exciting. He was like millions of others, swept up in that camera craze in the 20s and 30s. He was drafted at the age of 24. Here's just some advertisements, by the way, to illustrate just how widespread the marketing and consumption was, if you will, of purchasing of these cameras. This is a German military manual, kind of a magazine for soldiers, and they're promoting the camera, and they're telling ordinary German soldiers, this is called the optical Panzer, right? So this is going to be a really tough camera. You can see it's getting beaten up here, but it's withstanding combat. But it's all part of what these soldiers are supposed to have kind of in his knapsack. These are the postcards to send home, the care packages, and the camera. So the Germans were very, and the Slovakians, the other members of the Axis forces, the Slovakians were among those that joined the Germans in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, when the Holocaust, the mass murders began in earnest. So the camera itself is supposed to be about a kind of triumphalism in a way of documenting, being very aware that one is making history as one goes off to fight these monumental battles and defeat what the Nazis called Judeo-Bolshevism. And this was, the Germans wanted that to be documented and for that to be part of an individual soldier's experience of making history. However, they did not want Germans and their allied soldiers, in this case Slovakians, who were part of those security units, as auxiliaries, they didn't want them taking photos of the mass murder, of the actual executions. And Himmler and the SS organizations and the military organizations repeatedly sent around orders to ban the camera photographing of these mass executions and to confiscate those that film. So that was something that they could not manage entirely, and thankfully they couldn't, because now we have this evidence like the photo that we were just looking at. Here's another example of how photos are promoted by the German military to ordinary soldiers. So our Corporal Skrovina, our photographer, our Slovakian photographer, is standing about 20 feet from the actual murder. And his camera did not have a zoom or a telephoto lens. So once I figured out the model of the camera, I could try to then situate where the photographer was actually standing. And if you notice, nobody's really looking in his direction with any expression of alarm. They're not really looking at the camera. He's taking it openly, this picture. And this is important. Because he's doing it in a way, if it's taken openly like this, it seems to indicate, at least I assumed this in 2009, if he's taking it openly and so close to the murder, and he's in uniform as a guard, I thought he was a collaborator, a complicit in the killing. And indeed, by being there in uniform and wielding this camera openly and further denigrating the victims, he is participating in it and he is complicit. but that's not the full story. The history of the Holocaust was a German-led European attack against the continent's Jews. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the vast and deep involvement of non-Germans has come into sharper relief and made collaboration an even dirtier word, like the mud and blood staining these men's uniforms and shoes. The Ukrainians pictured here in Mariupol were not the prominent Quislings or Tizos, treasonous fascist leaders who sided with Hitler. These local policemen committed murder against their own neighbors. Populist leaders today, like Duda in Poland and Orban in Hungary, try to suppress and distort the history of collusion in the Holocaust, along with centuries of Jewish life and the corpses of murdered Jews lying just below the surface of their nations. Now, my first priority when I saw this image was to try to track down the killers, because as I mentioned, in 2009, I was actually working in the archives on an investigation against a prominent SS man, and trials were starting to kind of heat up again in Germany. And so it was possible, I saw that it might be possible to find one of these killers and bring about some sort of justice. So I went into the archives and started to look at the records on Mariupol, the German records on Mariupol. And here I want to show you more precisely where we are geographically, because I had to try to plot all the German forces that went through this region and the timing of that. Remember, we know the murder occurred on October 1941, and to try to see, which units were active in that town at that time. And this is, let's see, here's Kiev, Berdichev, Zhytomyr, and it's right here. It's right in, Mariupol is right in here, just to give you a sense of the location. And here it is when I first visited in 2014. This is what's left of this town, which is historically an important community. Actually, if you know Yiddish literature, there is a very famous play called the Dybbuk. It actually takes place in this town. So I think this is part of that history of Jewish life there that goes back centuries, actually, and it was mostly Jewish life under Polish rule, not Russian and Soviet rule, and a very interesting socioeconomic history of Ukrainian peasants and Jewish Orthodox communities and traders and tailors kind of living in the center of town. And then on the top of the hill of the town was the Polish manor, the Polish fortress that belonged to a famous count. And in fact, the murders that took place, including the one in our photograph, took place on the grounds of that former Polish, it was a park today, public park today. So that history is very much wrapped up in the actual fate of that Jewish community. The community numbered about 4,000 Jews at the turn of the century before the First World War, and had decreased to about 1,500 in 1941. So when those Nazis arrived in the summer of 1941, there were about 1,500 Jews in Mariupol. So I went into all these different German records, the Einsatzgruppen reports, the Order of Police reports, and this went on for a couple of years, actually, and I was not able to determine which unit was in that picture, and I kept going back to these. These are other pictures that our Skrovina, our photographer, took. As I mentioned earlier, it's part of a series of photos. In that camera that he carried, there was a limited number of exposures. I believe it was 7. And we have 5 of the photos. So that's really important technical detail that's also about his visual testimony. So in addition to the photo of the family that's being killed, Lubomir Skrovina also took pictures of these women. And here you can see this Jewish star right on her. You zoom in and you can see that she's wearing the Jewish armband. So clearly a victim of the Holocaust. But here, and from 1941, this is Nazi crimes. So, and here in this picture, I could see better the uniform. And I started to notice that it wasn't an Einsatzgruppen uniform. It didn't have the same jacket. It didn't have the same, we didn't have an SS insignia or a death's head kind of emblem on the cap. The collar was different. The buttons were different than the order police uniform. So I spent a lot of time looking at uniforms. And what I ended up finding out was that in our photographer, Lubomir Skrovina, as I mentioned, was these images were in the Prague archive because he was actually arrested in 1958 and interrogated about them as a collaborator in post-war Czechoslovakia. He was dragged in by what was a KGB-like authority in Prague at that time and questioned, you must be a war criminal, as I assume, because you have these photos. And when he was interrogated, because he was there and he knew, who was whom, our photographer mentioned a very important detail that anybody else would have passed over. But I had been studying these uniforms and I was so frustrated by the fact that I couldn't find the German unit. And he just mentioned in passing, oh yeah, I was there at this mass murder, this killing of peaceful citizens, as he called them, peaceful Soviet citizens in 1941. And he said, and the Germans who were there were finance guards. That was the literal translation. I thought, finance guards, So they were customs officials. These were individuals who were working in town. They were like checking packages at the local railway station. And they had just been brought in on the spot because this town was so small. It didn't have its own, SS headquarters or police headquarters. The neighboring town would send police forces there as needed. But these were just customs officials who were brought in. And then I realized that I started to go back into the German records. And sure enough, I found a very slim file. It was only about 60 pages in length from 1969 of a customs board, a border patrol unit stationed in this town in Mirapol in October 41. So I had found the unit. And this file is extraordinary because it turned out that one of the German men in this unit in 1969, in January 1969, now he's retired, and he's living about 10 miles south of Hanover, Germany. And he just appears in a local police station and says he wants to report a crime. That's just astounding to me that this former member of this unit decides, for whatever reason, on January 15th, 1969, he's going to go to the authorities about a crime that took place more than 20 years earlier than that. And he just explains what happened. And he explains that it was this Sunday night. He was in this town called Mirapol. He placed it in Russia. He placed it in the wrong country. But in any case, so he didn't have his geography was wrong. But he said, well, it was one particular night, a Sunday evening, and I was in the canteen with my comrades, and we were playing a German card game called Scott. And he said some SS men appeared in the canteen and said out loud, who would like to participate in an action tomorrow? It was a kind of euphemistic term, an action, kind of killing action. And this gentleman testified that two of his comrades stood up, said Jawohl, and he named the two of them, Erich Kuska and Hans Voigt, and they volunteered for the shooting commando. The next morning, he heard bullets coming from the fort to where the fortress was. And then later on in the evening, these two men, Hans Voigt and Erich Kuska, who are pictured here, they're one of these three men, came back to the barracks, which was only several hundred meters from the execution site. And they were showing off how satisfied they were about the opportunity to participate in the execution. One of them, Kuska, reenacted how he doled out, I'm reading from this testimony, doled out shots in the back of the necks of the Jews. And the gentleman who denounced his former comrades described going to this site and seeing the mass grave, and says it was 10 meters long, and he describes the location precisely. He said that the graves were only partially covered and he could see the limbs of the executed, and he knew that they were Jews. So I was able to determine who the German killers were in this photograph, but that case didn't go anywhere in 1969. This was not, the political climate in West Germany at this time was not to pursue justice aggressively. The political will was not there. Statutes of limitations were kicking in as far as whether one was an accomplice or could be charged with first-degree murder. And this file just sat and languished in this police station. And of course, that local authority, they didn't have access to the photos that we're looking at right here, which were sitting in the archive in Prague. I mean, if they had, tracked down these photos and done a bigger investigation, the faces of these killers, Kuska and Voigt, and the other members of this unit would have been visible, and they could have actually identified them. Instead, the interrogation of these former customs guards are just filled with one perjurous, one lie after the next. They said that they say they weren't there. They said they didn't do the shooting. They said only the Ukrainians did the shooting. They said, I don't know what you're talking about. So it's fascinating to read those testimonies that are filled with lies in 1969 from the Germans, and also a lot of significant details about what happened as well. And then to kind of have that photograph, in front of you is just a nice, interesting way to to analyze the evidence and see, frustrating, obviously, because they were not brought to trial. But this is the important point about doing research today, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the bringing together of all these archives, including the digitization of a lot of records and the collaboration, in the best sense of the word, of scholars on all these issues, which was, I could recognize dozens of people in terms of the help that was afforded me to find these. I'm not the only person discovering that. People are helping me find these items, including the camera. But this is what's possible now, and that's what we have. We have a kind of historical justice. On this topic of justice, I'm just checking the time. I also want to talk about the Ukrainians, because here's a contrasting situation. These are files that are at Yad Vashem of investigations done by the KGB in what was Soviet Ukraine. And indeed, here's the three Ukrainians who are pictured at the crime scene, and there are three of them, were actually identified and brought to trial in 1986 and 87. A prosecutor in Zhytomyr, very determined. So 20 years after that West German case didn't go anywhere, suddenly in behind the Iron Curtain in Soviet Ukraine, on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, the trial kind of ends in 1988, when the Ukrainians in our photograph, two of them who were identified, Gnatuk and Lesko, here are their arrest reports and their fingerprints. They were actually sentenced to death and killed by a firing squad in January 1988. This is one of the very last trials in the former Soviet Union. The third killer among the Ukrainians in the photo, he was a minor at the time of the offense. He was given 15 years in prison and hard labor. He was sent into inner Russia, and I don't have any, that's where the documentation stops. I don't know if he survived his incarceration and what happened to him after Ukraine achieved its independence in 1991. The Soviet records are really, in contrast to the German ones, very thorough and map out exactly what happened and are based on a lot of local testimony. And that local testimony was key in my work with Father Desbois. I decided been working with Yahad and Unum on various cases, and I decided to see them in action, see how how they did their field work. And so I gave the material I had to Father Desbois and his team, including these Soviet records. And in the summer of 2016, we actually went back and I watched them do their, kind of witness the way they operate and how they find witnesses in the town. And it's a fascinating process. I can explain it to you more when we have the Q&A. But here, for instance, is the map that we pulled out of the Soviet archives, a little hand-drawn map, colorful map. This is the Mirapol Park. This is the crime scene here, including the mass graves that they've drawn. The picture I showed you of the town of Mirapol, when I showed you that market square, that's right here, where the center is. This is where the Jews were gathered the night before October 13th, that in the evening brought here. And then in the early morning hours, and the Germans who testified and Ukrainians we interviewed, they could exactly say, oh, I remember the sun was coming up, or I remember I was going to the stable to feed the horses. It was like 8 a.m, or they have certain references to what time it is. And then they start to hear the gunfire and the commotion and the yelling. So we were able to piece this event together, reconstruct it, in some cases like down to the minute. And they were marched from here, about 300 Jews that day marched across, see the arrow, over this little river, and up here. This is where the former Polish fortress was, and across in here, this is the actual killing site. And this is it's a very short distance. This is like a 10-minute walk here from the center of the town to the park. So again, a lot of witnesses as they go through town, and the killing itself is so close to the village that there's the sounds and the smells that people have in their memories that they recounted when we went back with the Yahad and Unum team to interview them. What about the victims? And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the family, the fact that it was really striking to me that there was this kind of family unit in the center of the picture, and made me think more and more about the importance of the family in the history of genocide, in the history of the way the genocidaires imagine, in this case, a world without Jews, as Alon Confino titled his book, and then the experience of victims themselves as their families are being torn apart, as they have to witness the suffering of their own kin. And isn't that the most extreme assault that genocidaires can inflict? What thoughts ran through the mother or the aunt's mind, the woman in the photograph, as she was forced to march to the site with her child? Did that boy try to run away? Was he crying or in shock and confused? Was the father killed first before their eyes? According to the Yad Vashem Central Database of Shoah victims' names, about 50% of the Jews gunned down in the ravines, marshes, forests, and open fields of Ukraine have not been identified. Every fourth murder victim of the Holocaust lived in what is Ukraine, today's borders, that territory. The persons in the photo are among the missing. They have not been identified, and this image we have of them may very well be the only trace of their existence, of what happened to them. So what does one do with such an image? What does one do with such an image that one finds of a murder that's taking place, right? What is one's ethical response to that, even if it happened 70 years ago or 100 years ago? What do you do with that piece of evidence? And what do you do with an image when you come to realize that those individuals, those victims, are among the missing? There's been no crime report registered on their behalf with their names. The German, West German, who brought in the report in 1969 on that January night in his local police station, he didn't know the victims. He said, he actually said Jews in Russia. That was it. That was the extent of course, he didn't know who they were by name. The dominant scholarly approach and popular way of accounting for the Jewish victims, memorializing them, is through scale, 6 million. and through individual names and lives. When we have Yom HaShoah each spring, each April, we read those names aloud. When you go to the USHMM, you get an identity card with the details, biographical details of one victim. National commemorations treat the victims as large entities, population figures such as Poland's 3 million or Kiev's 33,000 who were shot in Babi Yar. What about the loss of a family? The family was the most intimate social unit that held communities together. Was not the murder of an entire family another dimension of the horror and loss and intent that it defines genocide? This is what genocide scholars refer to root and branch kind of genocide, a complete attempt to obliterate part of our human family. In the summer of 41, Hitler said to his Croatian ally, we will not have solved the Jewish question, the Jewish problem as he saw it in Europe, until every single family. He talked about the importance of killing every family. He said in the past, when this was not done, then the children would rise up and try to avenge on behalf of their loved ones, their parents, and that he was not going to allow that to happen again. There's very little information for a place like Mariupol. This is in terms of victims' names. This is a list that was compiled right after the Red Army reoccupied this territory, or liberated it and occupied it. And it's only a partial list. It's about 214 names. Researching victims is an undertaking that combines genealogy, social history, oral history, database list searches, and analysis. I can see in these names, for instance, these are handwritten in Russian, but as I looked at these are the family names, and then the birth dates, right? So I could start to make out based on the birth dates and names that these were family units. So as I tried to identify the victims in the picture, and again, this is an impartial list of the actual victims, I started to focus on boys born between 1935 and 1939, because in the photo, we see that little boy. The woman, it's hard to see her face, and you just don't know. She could be 30 years old, she could be 60 years old. But that little boy, you know, I could kind of narrow it down to someone, a little toddler, like 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years old. And as I did that and created these, restoring these family trees in a way for this actual location based on these victims lists, it was a very moving, actually, exercise that I was doing with colleagues at Yad Vashem, at that memorial site in Israel. And as we reconstructed those family trees, I realized that that this was also, that this kind of research is an important act of memorialization, restoring those families. And they're listed alphabetically, the way they're filed at Yad Vashem. There are pages of testimony that you can find on the internet. And I went from A to Z, and I was just trying to go through, find families in Mariupol and see if anybody had registered a missing family in Mariupol. And I was astounded. Here's the page of testimony, and here is one from Mariupol, to find that one had been submitted by a woman who actually lived in Southfield, Michigan, and that she had gone to Yad Vashem in 2000, and she had emigrated from Ukraine to the United States in 1994. And she wanted to register that part of her family, not her immediate family, but her cousins and her aunts, had been killed in the park. And this was the sheet that she filled out, Svetlana Budnitskaya here. And I was shocked to see this picture on the sheet, kind of this photo of these faces looking out at me. After having looked at that horrific photo of the faces turned away of those being killed, to see these faces looking right at me was just astounding. And in fact, less than 1% of the pages of testimony, of which we have millions, contain photos, and certainly not photos from 1941. This one was taken in 41. This is what's left of this Jewish family in Mariupol. And this is how they wanted to be. Remember, these are aunts, these are sisters, and these two children. I immediately went back to my hotel room and called Svetlana Budnitskaya. Her phone number was on the form. It's actually a 2-page form. And she picked up the phone. To my surprise, it was in the morning, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time in Michigan. And she had this heavy Russian accent. She said, "Hello, yes, I'm Svetlana Budnitskaya." I said, "My name is Wendy Lower. I'm a professor of history, and I'm calling you from Jerusalem. I found your page of testimony, and it shows that little boy in the image, because I found this little boy to be strikingly similar to the boy in the photo." And she responded to me, "They shot him, the fascists did, with his mother." And then I said, "What about this little girl, this other little child? Do you know her name?" And Svetlana just started to cry. "Send me a letter," she said. I'll give you more photos." And she talked about the fascists and how they were how they shot. Oh, there's my time's up. All this seemed against the odds, the improbability that a photo being taken by a Slovakian was locked in the Prague archives for decades when it could have been used by investigators, that it found its way to me in DC while I was in the archives that day, that I had identified the killers, that I was getting closer maybe to identifying the victims, that this Svetlana Budnitskaya, who said she picked up the phone and responded to my inquiry. But I had to be very careful. I did not want to obviously misidentify the victims. I did go back to the United States and I interviewed Svetlana, and unfortunately she could not positively identify the victims in the atrocity photograph. She told me the stories of this family, but we could not say for certain that those were the same people in that photograph. She was a child during the war. It was her father's sister. This is the father's sister here, Hiva. It's possible that it's Hiva because she went to the killing site with the little boy, but I cannot say for certain. And what about this other child? Because most of the victims who have not been identified in Ukraine are in fact children. Here's a better image of this photo. I don't have time to go into a full description of the photographer because I want to leave time for questions. But I do want to just give you one bit of information because it's really important to the story of the photographer. I wouldn't want you to think that that he was the man that he appeared to be given the photo that he took. Well, it turns out that our photographer, when he took this picture, these are our interviews with Ukrainian witnesses, by the way, this is Yahad and Unum when we worked with them. That photo that he took, here's his testimony. I want to go back. This is where we go into do the field work here and found the mass grave site, and we actually found bones at the site. When that photographer took this image and a series of images that day, that was his, what we would call today, his enough moment. That was his turning point. He took these photos and hid them. He knew they were incriminating. Went back to Bratislava, back to Slovakia, told his wife, and they actually became part of the resistance. He shared the photos with Jews who were left in Bratislava who had not yet been deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. He hid a Jewish doctor and his family in his attic. This man was also a obstetrician, and he actually brought his son. The photographer's son was born in 1943 in their house and was delivered by this Jewish doctor. And he was involved in the Slovak uprising in 1944. So this young man who witnessed the Holocaust up close and in uniform, pretended to be sick, got out of his military duties, went back home, and actually tried to shelter and rescue Jews. The photographer's self-awareness at the time is an interesting point of where I want to kind of sign off here. If we think about a photograph like this as a statement, a visual testimony, according to historian James Curtis, a specialist of early American photography, the meaning of a documentary photograph must begin by establishing the historical context for both the image and its creator. A photographer is an historical actor bent upon communicating a message to an audience. Documentary photographs are more than expressions of artistic skill. They are a conscious act of persuasion. The work of the most accomplished photographers reveals a fervent desire to let images tell a story. Documentarians from Matthew Brady, who took the early Civil War photos, to Dorothea Lange, succeeded because they understood the desires of their audience and did not shy from molding their images accordingly. Far from being passive observers, documentary photographers are active agents searching for the most effective ways to communicate their views. Lubomir Skrovina, the photographer, died in October 2005. And before he died, he did two things regarding his photos. In 1994, Slovakia now, post-Soviet Slovakia, he wrote a letter to the Minister of the Interior and requested the return of his photos of Jewish civilians executed in Ukraine. They were in that Prague archive. He did something else which was rather surprising. He donated the camera that he used, which I showed you before, to the Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava, and asked specifically that they be used in a new exhibit on the Holocaust. Photographs, if we choose to study them, are not merely illustrations of an event, nor do they bring closure to a traumatic event. They open up new questions and lead one down paths of discovery to new stories about what happened. Some post-war theorists of atrocity photography would urge us not to even look, let alone scrutinize the suffering of others. Cultural critic Susan Sontag argued that the shock of the photography might wear off, and that we would potentially become a kind of inured to this with repeated viewings. I disagree. The risk of desensitization to such photos exists where we have no knowledge of the photo's history and content. The more I learned, the more the image came to life. One such moment was in October 2014. I had asked my technical support services staff at my college to create the highest resolution images of the photo. And we created those cutouts that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, like puzzle pieces. And I focused on each piece about looking at the time of day and the clothes and all the elements that I described to you earlier. But my eyes were always drawn back to the center. I started to look at the position of the crouching woman and wondered why she was bent over in that perpendicular angle and not buckling under or kneeling forward. And then I saw something resting on the woman's lap. It was a hazy, curved form where light was not passing through, which should have been an empty space. I could make out a pair of bending knees and a translucent fabric of a dress. I started to see the faint lines of an elbow and a small scarfed head. And suddenly what came into my view was the existence of another person, a child on her lap. It looked like a girl. I had found another soul about to be extinguished, another nameless victim of the Holocaust who was supposed to be lost to us. And those faint contours were her only trace. Only now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was it possible for me to connect this image to the thousands of pages of investigative material who had material and witnesses who had the view that we see here, who dug the pits, the policemen who drove the family to the edge of the pit, the perpetrators who pulled the triggers, the laborers who covered the mass grave, and the forensic investigators who exhumed it in 1986, and the photographer who was haunted by this image until he died in 2005. Over time, the physical traces of the mass graves and former ghettos will be harder to detect and identify, but the millions of Jews who were massacred in broad daylight in places such as Latvia, Ukraine, and Poland did not disappear as the perpetrators wished. And in fact, many perpetrators and collaborators photographed them in their final moments. A single photo can recover what was assumed to be destroyed without a trace. It can illuminate the methodological possibilities and pitfalls of 21st century research. Holding the photo, I realize the power of such an image as it passes across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and a viewing public. It has the power to put things in motion and to elicit from those who study the image or are questioned about it an avalanche of emotions and information that advances our understanding and knowledge of the Holocaust. Thank you very much.
Wendy, thank you very much, Professor Lower. That was a wonderful and very moving presentation. Thank you. I know we're going a little bit late, but I think that it would be nice to give a few minutes, if that's okay with you, and okay with our participants, a few minutes to ask questions. So I'd like to invite everybody who would like to ask questions, if you would please add them to the chat, and we'll try to answer them straight away. So let's take a look here. I see a couple of people are heartbroken, and yeah, that was very, very, very powerful. But really great to get a sense of who these people were, all of the people really involved. So, so one question, and you mentioned it again, but maybe we should just, if there was one thing you would take in terms of the educational piece, you know, for the classrooms, what would you add for that?
Yeah, in addition to helping students study photographs and ask questions of them and to kind of pick them apart and try to figure out and even to develop their kind of ethical sensibilities as far as not only the sensitivities surrounding these images, of course, they're shocking and heartbreaking and emotional, but also this argument that I'm making in terms of the search for the missing. I mean, if those persons were your relatives, right? On the one hand, you wouldn't want that displayed, that atrocity photo. On the other hand, you would want to find out who everyone is in that picture and what happened that day. So, you know, that these aren't simply meant to be kind of illustrations so that we can recall the history in the way that I talked about in the beginning of the talk, but they are actually, in many cases, the only physical trace we have of, in this case, an entire community, that entire community of Mirapol. There's nothing. There's not even a scrap of paper from the German. I think I have one document that says 4 Jewish men were killed because they were work shirkers in the summer of 41, but that's it. For a community that was, you know, centuries old and had generated that incredible cultural life. Very famous ethnographers were going to this community, and you know, and the cemetery there is vandalized now, but you can see the remnants of it. It's like spectacular, and the vibrancy that was there, the culture that was there. The image I showed you of the center of the town now, it's just gutted, and that's because of you know, the combination of 20th century calamities in Ukraine. But you know, when you find such a picture, whether it's in a textbook or it's on the internet, you know, to sit down with students and go through that exercise, there's a lot of atrocity imagery that they will be exposed to, whether it's a little boy who washed up on the Bodrum beaches, the Syrian refugee boy, Alan Kurdi, or we grew up with images from, you know, napalm attack in Vietnam, little girl running naked, you know, or the image of the separated families at the detention centers. You know, of course you need to be careful about how you present them in class, and you don't want to cause them any trauma themselves or nightmares. But they're out there, they're unavoidable. So I think at some point, you know, maybe with not as graphic an image as the one I just showed you, depending on the age of your students, but to maybe pull out, you know, some of the more iconic ones that they have seen, and to push a little bit more with them and say, well, what's going on here, and help them pick apart the image and ask the who, what, where, what, you know, because they then will be better critical consumers, as it were, of what's out there on the internet, what they're going to see in newspapers, and especially now the way things are manipulated and whatnot, and memes, to be more responsible kind of readers of the imagery that surrounds us.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions here. One of the questions is, what are the pictures that are on the screen now?
Oh yeah, I didn't get to that, but I think this is something when I was at the museum at the Mandel Center a couple of years ago, working on this book project, and I started to, focus on the shoes in the image, and just had that in my mind. These shoes, like why are the shoes this iconic kind of source of remembrance of the individual victims? Every pair of shoes is individual, right? And just reflecting on that. And then I came across this image. It's a famous photographer, Bella Liebman. And this is Szeged in Hungary. And the Jews had been deported from Szeged, about 10,000 in 44. These were these last killing waves to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Hungarian Jews. And in this case, the photographer who survived went back to Szeged, and these are women who are searching for loved ones and trying to identify who was deported in this, where these shoes, and you can see it's in the synagogue, and there's also some furniture there too. But I just was so struck by, and there's a Red Army kind of soldier there who's standing guard over these are the remnants, the belongings of the Jews who had been deported and killed. And again, it's just, here's the active search. So you have a kind of more passive memorial culture where we enshrine the shoes, right? And this to me was so striking, because they're actively searching for the missing, and they're doing it through, like, by going through these shoes. And Bella Liebman actually testified or submitted these photos to a case in Toronto, Canada, against one of the Hungarian gendarmes. I just discovered this after my book went into production. And these were put into the courtroom. These images we're looking at right here. So it's also then, again, about the photograph being part of how we testify. It becomes a kind of agent in its own way. It starts investigations. It can convict the killers, like just the power of the photograph as evidence as well.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, but truth be told, it's pretty late. So if it's okay with you, Professor Lower, if I could send those questions to you,
Sure.
and if you'd be willing to answer them. I just want to take a moment again to thank you, Professor Lower, and everybody in attendance. Would also like to thank our Vice President for Education, Elizabeth Edelstein,
Oh,
and
hi.
and also my colleague Joanna Arruda for joining us. Our next program will be, I believe, December 7th with Avi Pot. I hope everybody will join us for that as well. In the email that you received, you should have the information how to sign up. And before we sign off, we'll do a little, Professor Lower and Joanna will do a little debrief afterwards. So I'll send a separate link for that, if that's okay.
Oh, sure. I'll stick around then and look for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I want to thank everybody again. Have a great evening. And again, Professor Lower, thank you for a wonderful and moving presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.